So I'm delighted to welcome you all here and welcome Federico Fabbrini, who's going to be talking on the euro after COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. Federico is a fellow in law at Princeton University, so he's visiting this year, full year. And he's full professor of European law and the School of Law and Government, as well as director of the Law Research Center at Dublin City University. In addition, he's the founding director of the DCU Brexit Institute, which we know is in Ireland.
It is.
Which is important, where he is the principal investigator of the EU-funded Jean Monnet Network Bridge and the EU-funded Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Rebuild. So Federico's research focuses on EU law with a wide-ranging set of interests across fields including fundamental rights, economic and monetary union, Brexit, and the future of Europe more generally. Federico holds a BA from the University of Trento, a JD from the University of Bologna, and a PhD in law from the European University Institute. He also interned as a clerk for Justice Sabino Cassese at the Italian Constitutional Court. And I should just note, in parentheses, Sabino Cassese is arguably the most important constitutional lawyer, expert, judge, etc., and a wonderful person as well. So that's also another bit of kudos. And before joining DCU, Federico was at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark and at Tilburg Law School in the Netherlands. So Federico is the author of 4 single-authored books, all with Oxford University Press, including the latest, which is on fiscal capacity, to which Federico will be speaking today. And he's also editor or co-editor of, I think, a dozen volumes, including 4 edited books with Oxford focused on Brexit, plus an additional 3 books in Italian. I'm not going to ask you your age, but it puts us all to shame. But anyway, wonderful. Wonderful to have you. Oh, I should also say that Federico is the son of Sergio Fabbrini, who's been here to give talks as well. So we can see that.
And I take no credit for that.
But he will take credit for you.
Yes.
So I think without further ado, I'll let you start.
Thank you so much, Vivien, for this very generous introduction and for this invitation to come here at Boston University today. It's really my great pleasure to speak at the Pardee School of Global Governance, and specifically at the Center for the Study of Europe that you established a number of years ago, and which is one of the most famous institutions for researching and reflecting on Europe in the United States. So it's really a great honor for me to be here with you this morning.
Did we record this?
It is being recorded, so.
So send it out everywhere.
So the topic on which I'm going to talk with you today is my new book, which, as Vivien said, is entitled EU Fiscal Capacity, Legal Integration After COVID-19 and the War in Ukraine, which is coming out with Oxford University Press exactly a month from today, both in hardback and paperback. And this is the result of our research I've been doing over a number of years. Those of you who know of my work, I focused on economic and monetary union basically since the Euro crisis. I got interested into this topic, and I've continued reflecting on them more recently in light of the developments that have occurred during the pandemic. So the purpose of the research and of the book is to explore how the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and now the war in Ukraine are affecting the European constitutional architecture of economic governance, what we call, using technical terminology, economic and monetary union. And the core argument of the book is that the action of the EU institutions and the member state in the last 2 years, the measures taken to address the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic have led to a profound transformation of the constitutional architecture of economic governance of Europe. And more specifically, the game changer was the establishment of the NextGenerationEU Recovery Fund, which, as you know, is a special budget worth 750 billion euros at 2018 prices, now over 800 billion euros at current prices, which is funded by issuing common debt. The resources are then transferred to the member states as both grants and loans, and the whole budget will be repaid down the line by issuing new European taxes. So Next Generation EU leads to the establishment of a fiscal capacity in the European Union, completing basically the architecture of EMU, which had remained asymmetric from the very beginning. The problem of Next Generation EU, however, from a legal point of view, is that it's technically designed to be a temporary solution to deal with a specific issue. And therefore, in the book, I try to reflect what's next. And in light of the war in Ukraine, I basically make the normative argument that we should consolidate this fiscal capacity and make it a permanent feature of the EU system to deal with the new challenges that Europe is facing. So in terms of structure, the book and also my presentation today takes a chronological perspective, a fairly linear one. It first begins by looking at the constitutional architecture of economic and monetary union before the pandemic, including the lack of a fiscal capacity and endless debate on the possibility to create one. It then shifts to the transformations of EMU during the pandemic with the build-up of Next Generation EU, and it finally concludes by thinking prospectively of what's next for EMU in light of the war in Ukraine. So I'm going to go very quickly through these points, and Vivien mentioned to me that some students might be attending the talk as well. So I've added a few slides which might include some sort of basic pieces of information. Perhaps they're obvious to everybody, but I just thought it might be helpful to have them there. So just to remind you all, the establishment of economic and monetary union with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 was, by many measures, one of the most significant developments in the process of European integration. With the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, states decided to give up their monetary sovereignty and create a single currency, the euro, which was obviously both a major economic step but also a political one, and last but not least, a very symbolic one as well. However, the creation of EMU was the result of a compromise between competing state interests. On the one hand, therefore, member states decided to centralize monetary policy in a federal institution, the European Central Bank. But on the other, on the contrary, the states didn't dare to make the equivalent step on the economic side, and rather left economic policy decentralized at the national level without creating a central fiscal capacity. Now, those features of the system have effectively remained unchanged from the 1990s to the pandemic. Of course, the euro crisis was a major challenge for the functioning of the eurozone, and a number of reforms were adopted then, but they didn't tackle this original asymmetry. And while much debate, as I mentioned, occurred in the last decade on the possibility of creating a fiscal capacity, for political reason it was impossible to get there because of a strong cleavage between northern and southern states, debitor and creditors. So from a legal point of view, actually, economic and monetary union was born as a hyper-legalized constitutional system. There was no centralized fiscal capacity, as I just mentioned, but to avoid negative externalities between the economic policies of the member states, the treaties created basically a set of binding rules that all member states had to respect as a precondition to run a safe budgetary policy. Those are the famous rule of the Stability and Growth Pact. So for the students, this is really the most important piece of legislation that has to be looked at. And as many of you will know, the Stability and Growth Pact compelled countries to run a deficit below 3% of GDP per year and to reduce their debt to 60% of GDP over the long term. It also created an excessive deficit procedure to monitor countries that might be violating those fiscal rules. And last but not least, to make credible all this legal architecture, the Treaty of Maastricht included a no bailout clause that prohibited financial assistance to failing countries, and also banned monetary funding by the central bank. So a hyper-legalized legal system, which in fact did not work so well, as we know, throughout the euro crisis. But again, as I said, the responses to the euro crisis did not tackle the structural imbalance between economic and monetary policy at the origin of EMU. Now, what happened during the pandemic, or what happened because of the pandemic, I should say? The explosion of COVID-19 in early 2020 immediately prompted states to actually react in multiple ways. We have all gone through it because of public health measures. A number of restrictions had to impose. The economy came to a sudden halt. Demand and supply stopped all of a sudden. As a result of the fiscal rules I just discussed, it was inevitable for European countries to immediately seek coordinated action within the European framework. The ECB played a very important role initially with the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, which confirmed its major role in EMU. But then also the other institutions acted. The Commission suspended the Stability and Growth Pact. The Eurogroup approved a mechanism called SURE to provide unemployment insurance to workers who were losing their jobs. And other solutions, for example, in the field of competition policy, were adopted by suspending essentially state aid rules to allow governments to bail out effectively companies who were in financial trouble. But as I would argue, the real game changer was the establishment of the NextGenerationEU Recovery Fund in the summer of 2020. The French and the Germans were the first to put forward a proposal in that respect. The Commission eventually took it on board, and after 5 days of endless negotiations in the European Council, in the summer of 2020, heads of state and governments agreed on the NextGenerationEU and authorized the establishment of this special fund. Now, as I said previously, the fund is very innovative in 3 dimensions. First of all, it empowers the Commission to borrow money on the financial markets, therefore issuing common debt on behalf of all the member states. It allows the Commission to spend this money by transferring them to European countries either as grants or as loans. And lastly, it commits the institution to introduce new taxes to repay the debt and the interest in the long term. So is this really an Hamiltonian moment? That's a question I'm putting out there, not least because yesterday at Harvard, Vivien asked me about it. But let me just zoom in for, again, informative purposes on the structure of NextGenerationEU, because from a legal point of view, it's very interesting how the institutions used a constellation of laws to create this innovative fund. So in this slide, I've listed almost all of the pieces of legislation that underpins the creation of this fund. There's in fact one more that I didn't squeeze in, but you have a regulation, you have a decision, you have another regulation of the European Parliament and the Council, and also a new conditionality mechanism has been added to the system to make sure that countries getting the funding respect the rule of law principles of the European Union. So it is a complex legal regime, and in my book I try to zoom in a little bit more with greater detail on how these pieces of legislation interplay one with the other. I don't want to do this now because I don't think there is enough time for this, but just to show that it is a fairly complicated system, but at the same time one that could be created within the current treaty framework of the European Union. So there was no need really to amend the treaties or adopt international agreements outside the EU legal order, which I think shows how flexible and adjustable the constitutional framework of the European Union is. Now, looking forward, what are the prospects for economic governance and economic and monetary union beyond COVID-19? And here there are a number of trends or questions that have to be monitored and answered. One is of course the management of this massive recovery fund, which is raising some challenges for the Commission as well. For example, the enforcement of the rule of law is remaining an open question in many ways. The other issue is the implementation of the Next Generation EU money and resources. And here I want to flag the case of Italy because given its size and given how impactful the pandemic was on the Italian economy, Italy is actually receiving almost a third of the entire NGEU financial envelope. So what Italy does is clearly very important for the success of the program. But beyond that, of course, the big question looming sort of large in the policy debate, as well as in the academic one, I would say, is what's next? Is this just going to be a one-off fund done to deal with the pandemic, or will it become a long-term part of an embedded reform of economic and monetary union? And here, theories of historical institutionalism would say you have path dependency. Once something is there, there's a tendency to keep it, but also legal scholarship on emergency legislation has pointed out that once something is adopted during times of emergency, there is a tendency to then make it a permanent feature of the legal system. Now, this makes all the more sense if you bring in the picture now the war in Ukraine, which of course has started in February this year, just as Europe was moving out, Europe and the world were moving out of the global pandemic, and has immediately posed an existential challenge again to the European Union. Of course, the war in Ukraine is creating primarily damages for Ukraine, but there are a lot of negative externalities afflicting the countries of the European Union. You have higher humanitarian assistance costs, you have an energy crisis that is clearly determined by the war in itself with the rise of inflation, and of course you have growing demand for greater investment on defense. So I have a next slide here, actually, knowing that some of the people in this room are real experts on security and defense in Europe. I just wanted to flag some numbers to give you a sense of the demands that we are facing here. You all know that NATO had a target for contracting parties to reach 2% of GDP on defense by 2020, and that has not been met basically by any of the EU member states except a few. What the EU did in 2020, when the new financial architecture was being built, was to set up a special so-called European Peace Facility Fund, EPF, but the budget of the EPF is 5 billion euros. And I just added to this slide two numbers which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. One is the cost of US military assistance to Ukraine in the last, 6 months since February to today, which is $54 billion. And this is the cost of the National Recovery Plan of Ukraine, what the Ukrainian government put forward over the summer as its estimate of what it will cost to rebuild the country after the war is finished, and they put the tag at $750 billion, which is basically the size of the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund. So if you look at all this, it seems fairly clear to me that Europe will have to invest in a permanent fiscal capacity and endow itself with the financial resources to tackle these geostrategic challenges that it's now facing. So a year ago, the discussion was, is the future of Next Generation EU connected to what Italy does? And I think probably at that time the conversation was right. I think we are now in a different world, and the future of fiscal resources for Europe will be driven much more significantly by questions about common security and defense policy and the need to endow the EU of strategic autonomy over the next months and years. So let me conclude, because I know my time is running out. The core argument I've been trying to make in my presentation and in the book is that Next Generation EU leads towards a rebalancing of the economic and monetary legs of EMU, and effectively it pushes Europe in a direction of fiscal integration, which is very similar to that of the US federal system. In the book, I have a longer comparative section where I analyze the complex historical developments of our fiscal capacity in the US, and I think there are remarkable similarities. But of course, we are still in the middle of crossing the river, or the Rubicon, if you will, because Next Generation EU has endowed the EU with a fiscal capacity, but it's formally temporary, and so we still need to work to make it into a permanent feature. As I said, I think the war in Ukraine really requires Europe to consolidate that process moving forward. So I'll stop here, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks so much, Federico, for a great talk. And I should warn Federico, but we had a conversation yesterday at Harvard, and so I'm going to ask you similar kinds of questions, but some not. But so first, just to say a bit about the book, and I highly recommend it. It's accessible, it's readable, it's and wonderful because it starts from a legal perspective. And as a legal perspective, and I think this was part of your answer yesterday, it's more empirical. So political scientists tend to start with the theory and then move into the empirics, but here we've got the empirics. But of course, because you're focusing on sort of the legal bases of all of this, it forces you for you to be more grounded more immediately, and then you move up. So you're not going to find much of the political science EU studies theories about is this all, and if you think about the debates about the Eurozone crisis and the responses, it was all about is this intergovernmentalism, a kind of rational institutionalist kind of approach? It's all about bargaining in the council, and then you get the response, no, it's about supranationalism, so it's really the Commission leading things, or the ECB. And then you get a few people from, talking about parliamentarism, that actually the European Parliament's gaining more power. Or the post-functionalists who say actually the EU, the EU, because of rising Euroscepticism, this helps explain the constraining consensus that makes it impossible to do anything. And what's nice by taking it from this perspective is it says, well, folks, yeah, a lot was done. And that although one might use historical institutionalism and even rational choice to talk about path dependency, to talk about the sort of the framing of creditors versus debtors, COVID doesn't fit at all. And what's interesting from the legal perspective is you see the kind of inventiveness and innovation that you get from all of the actors involved. And that this actually also plays an important role in the response to the Eurozone crisis. We might not like what the responses were, but there was also deepening integration at that time, as I think you talk about nicely in the book. So I guess one of the big questions is, how do we explain the kind of flexibility in the law? And you said, not here, but yesterday, and this resonated with me, given my interest in ideas and discourse, is you talked about the language of the law. And that this is about language, this is about interpretation, and what's really important is the innovation comes from the way in which EU actors of all kinds work together, separately or against one another, to interpret or to reinterpret the rules and the laws, and that there was actually lots of fighting going on between them. And we don't get enough of that in your account here, so I might want to ask you to develop that a bit farther. But I think so the one thing is I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the language and the reinterpretation, because I think that's really important, because it talks about the importance of the ways in which these kinds of battles play themselves out within the legal context. So that's one question and point I'd like you to go into more. But then you answered the next question, which was, is this a Hamiltonian moment or not? And I think You're right to say, well, it's not quite a Hamiltonian moment, but it's a major shift. And I guess the question is this temporary facility going to become a permanent one? And how, we can't predict, but do you expect it to become? And I take your point about the central role of Italy. I remember I was in Italy last March talking to people, and whereas I was all, as usual, optimistic, enthusiastic, it's all the Italian higher level officials or pundits or think tankers who are saying, Vivien, Italy's not going to be able to do this. No way it can implement this, kind of the administrative failures of the state. I didn't say failed state, I said the administrative failures of the state mean that it can't do this. And of course at the time, then there was a concern, but Germany's looking and everyone else is looking to Italy. And if Italy blows it, then there's never going to be a permanent fund. But as you said, rescued by the Ukraine war. I mean, I hate putting it that way. But that's clearly because the whole framing now shifts. And it's no longer, is Italy, are we going to have to extend this? Should we extend it? But rather, what do we do? And so the next question is, does one build from NextGenerationEU, or does one have to set up, with a different rationale, a whole different set of monetary facilities? And how does one do that in terms of the law? And does that mean you have to go to the council and have them agree or not? And I guess in this, we just talked about the role of Italy. What's the role of Germany? And if we look at the way in which the coalition government is moving in the direction of we're going to do all the things we need to do ourselves and to hell with the EU, is a kind of sense, at least in terms of common energy policy, let alone the Ukraine war. So my question would be, I mean, I think we all in this room probably believe that there's a necessity for doing this. And I know that you did not mention climate change, which is part of NGEU. How do you move climate change into this? Let alone refugee crises, immigration, forced migration, all of that. But I guess the final question would be about the war in the Ukraine, and I'm going to leave it to Kaya to raise more questions about this. But it's about, is the EU up to becoming a serious player? Also, given the shift to NATO, where's CSTP? I think I'm seeing you talk about this in the book, but what's the possibility of the EU, whether under the umbrella of NATO or separate, developing its own capacity to deal with the neighborhood, especially in light of the possibility, I didn't say probability, possibility in 2024 of a Trump comeback. Yeah. So I think that's enough to start your discussion, and then of course we'll open it up to the
Shall I try to address this? And I should say, Vivien, you actually asked me different questions from yesterday, so fair play to you. And I'm grateful for all your comments and your thoughts. I'll maybe try to structure my answer in 3 points, hoping to address most, if not all, of the issues you were raising. So the first one on the law, and I feel the support of having other lawyers in the room today. So, but I think certainly what you write is correct. We lawyers have an empirical basis to start with, which is treaties, legislations, court cases, and then we kind of build up our theories and interpretation rather than the other way around. But certainly, I should discard any idea that there is an effort here at criticizing political science theories. I did it, not you. With that said, I think it's interesting how the crisis has led to a reinterpretation of the meaning of specific treaty provisions, which confirms that the law is flexible. It can be given different meaning based on context. And I think for the lawyers in the room, this is really nothing new. We know it from lots of prior cases in the context of the European Union and tons of other cases in other comparative contexts. What I think might be interesting to reflect here is the fact that the treaty provisions on economic and monetary union had until 2020 been read under the dominant influence of ordoliberal theories. And maybe there's work for you on discursive institutionalism here to be done, because in fact if you read the treaties, there's the word ordoliberal never appears. If you read the comprehensive architecture of the treaty, you could have always said, and I had said it, I have an article published in 2015 where I said the EU has the treaty basis to build an economic competencies like a fiscal capacity, you don't need to change it. But for years it was kind of a taboo argument, because I think the dominant reading, very much influenced by German legal and economic thinking, was the EMU chapter in the EU treaties is simply entrenching ordoliberal theory on the rule of law in the economy. And in fact, that's not true. So in a sense, the constitution of the European Union, the treaties are much more open-ended in their interpretation.
Can I just,
sure.
Just because I realize there's one, I think, important question here which deals with the issue of reinterpretation, and that is there are numbers in there. It's governing by rules and ruling by numbers. Sure. And there are numbers all over, not just in the treaties, but all over texts. How can you reinterpret those?
The numbers cannot be reinterpreted, so that they are definitely rigid. So the 3% rule provides a clear mandate, but then the 3% rule on deficit is surrounded by other language which allows for flexibility in other ways. But what the real reinterpretation that have occurred during COVID is not so much on the fiscal constraints, which formally are still there, albeit suspended for the time being. The reinterpretation is, so it's not on the negative constraints, but it's more on the positive entitlement to act. Because the traditional view was that the EU lacked treaty basis to set up positive intervention in the economy, like neo-Keynesian type of action. And the really interesting change was around cohesion policy. So if I go back to my prior slide here, if you look at that, the key instrument here is the RRF. Sorry, I made a mistake in the acronym, is Recovery and Resilience Facility. And that is actually grounded on treaty provisions on cohesion policy, which traditionally had a very specific function of supporting underdeveloped regions in the European Union, and have now been reinterpreted as saying, yes, because we need to have cohesion across the European Union, we can invest $800 billion euros in having a recovery fund for the whole EU. That clause had never been read as enabling greater federal action in the economy, and that was really one of the major reinterpretation during the pandemic. Which takes me to your second point about sort of the Hamiltonian moment and the transformation of a federation. And I obviously put it in I think it's the prior slide here with a question mark, because I think the jury is still out. But what I would point out, and I did it yesterday at Harvard as well, is that I think the concept of a Hamiltonian moment is misleading, because if you look at the history of the US, there was that Hamiltonian moment in 1791, but it took actually another 130 years to get to the US federal government playing a big role in the economy. And that shows how unions of states have to undergo complex historical processes of building up centralized power, with moments of centralizations and decentralizations following each other. And I think again here it is possible to speak of one Hamiltonian moment, but you need many of them actually to get where you want to end up, which is also your third question. So I'll come to my third point here on the future of next generation EU, defense, the role of Italy and Germany, and new infrastructure. So I think what Next Generation EU provides is a template that can be used now to deal with different problems like the war in Ukraine. So the fund the recovery fund in itself cannot really be prolonged. It has a maximum envelope of resources which are available. So what you really have to do is to use that same template to address new crises. And legally, you now have really a model that you can almost copy paste for new purposes. Is it politically feasible to do that? I think that was basically one of your question. And I would add then another point, which is it constitutionally legitimate? So on the political feasibility, clearly Germany plays the big role here, much more than Italy, because Italy has already asked for a NGEU 2.0 to deal with the Ukraine war. When Mario Draghi was prime minister, he spoke at the European Parliament in May this year saying we should use the same technology, legal technology, to deal with the cost of the war. The real challenge is Germany, which remains a bit mysterious, because you would think they'd be the most interested now in wanting to do it again, since they are so dependent on Russian energy and so dependent on Chinese exports, and therefore with their economic model increasingly crumbling in front of geostrategic changes. But as we also discussed yesterday, I think there is an enduring influence of old economic ideas, which is still pervasive in the political culture of the country, and which makes it hard to get there. And yet, I think Germany has also made remarkable changes over the last few years. So I would still give them the benefit of the doubt, and I'd be hopeful that might happen. Not so much maybe because of a convinced decision, but simply because events, dear boy, events type of approach. With that said, the other side of the story is this question of constitutional legitimacy that I simply wanted to briefly mention, and I'm grateful for your question because it allows me to underline a point I didn't touch on in my remark, which is that as much as NextGenerationEU could be done without changing the treaty, I think long term, particularly if a fiscal capacity becomes a permanent feature of the EU, you need to tackle issues of legitimacy and democratic accountability. In particular, there are two areas, and I discuss them in the book. There are two institutional aspects that have to be dealt with without further ado. One is giving greater role to the European Parliament on budgetary matters. At the moment, the European Parliament is basically cut out of the entire discussion, and basic principles of no taxation without representation require that to be fixed. And the other is the decision-making process in the Council. The fact that the Council decides by unanimity tax matters, budget matters, etc., it's simply unsustainable. If you have to decide on a small budget, it's a mess, but it's a small budget. If you need to raise resources for trillions of euros, you can't depend on the minimum common denominator and the agreement of the most laggard member state. So those two institutional questions will have to be dealt with if Europe wants to consolidate a fiscal capacity, and that requires treaty change. So the long-term prospect to me is that fiscal union goes hand in hand with some deeper forms of political union as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Vivien.
so open it up to questions. I have a series of questions. Thank you so much. This was fantastic, and it scratches a lot of itches I've had in the last few months in terms of thinking about this. And first of all, I want to say I appreciate. I'm going to be looking and pulling the book and probably assigning the chapter in the conclusion with the comparison to the U.S. because I've been constantly looking for something readable for assigning to students about this to cut through this debate about how it was a process going over 80, 90 years from the Hamiltonian moment in the United States to actual market-preserving fiscal federalism. And this is such an important point to make. And I've been slogging through with, I think it's Eric Wibble's piece from 2003 about the US states crisis in 1840 when I assigned it to EU's students studying the EU. And it's a bit much, really, to be dragging through the United States in the 1840s. So I expect your chapter will be much clearer based on your talk. So thank you. So that I just appreciate. But I wasn't chastened by Vivien's comments about political scientists, because I do want to push you in a positivist sense, because the question is, how can we, okay, yes, it is driven by events.
But there is something here too, this constellation of informal efforts that kind of accumulate in a way. I'm trying to kind of theorize in real time because the theories don't do it for me. You know what I mean? The answer isn't in the theories of European integration. There's something else that is potentially rhetorical, discursive. It's also potentially institutional and material in terms of these being pathways or stepping stones. I don't know if it just make things better to have informal efforts or, not informal. Informal is not the right word, but temporary efforts that kind of make everyone feel soothed and feel better about this as pilot projects in a way, or if there's something actually institutional about this, that if you collect a collection of things, can we say anything in a positive sense about whether that makes the likelihood of more formal, permanent fiscal cooperation likely? So that's just kind of a big, unfair question to push you a little bit in a positivist way to say, is there theory building opportunity here? What other cases would you point to for theory building? And so I'm not trying to force a prediction here, but because I've been in this hot seat too in the last few months where people have said, do you think that the creation of the European Peace Facility will lead to X, Y, and Z? And I have just said, I'm outside the theories here. I feel like there's a there about the creation of these informal efforts that accumulate in some way, or layer potentially, kind of a layering institutional theory that make it easier or make it more likely for the strike of a pen or a little side agreement between two countries to allow it to be uploaded as a more formal, permanent thing. So that's the first comment. And the second comment is specific to the European Peace Facility. So,
which I put on the slide,
knowing
you would be here.
It's catnip for me. I had to make a comment. And it's great because this is, this is something I'm watching, but it's also opaque to me a little bit. But I have a prediction, and it's really just a functional prediction. And that is that, the European Peace Facility wasn't just created in 2022. It was created prior to 2022 as kind of a cluster of events in reaction to 2014 and Crimea. And it became formal in 2021, and it was first for non-lethal aid. But it also, in the treaty, well, it's not treaty-based, it's outside the treaties, in the decision, it allowed for lethal aid as well, which is the game changer, that the EU now in 2022 has activated that, and at a decision level to allow it to be lethal, which is, for the history of the EU, a sea change. But what's interesting about it is there were a lot of prior commitments to that 5 billion euros to, I think, now I'm blanking, I think Guinea-Bissau maybe, or Morocco, or there are a couple other countries, and then I think also Georgia and a few other places got commitments for non-lethal aid. So some of that money was already spent, and then it's been spent in 5 billion euro tranches 6 or 7 times. And so we're up to almost 4 billion euros already spent, and the money was supposed to be from 2021 to 2027. I'm not trying to lecture, but this is in service of a question, And so what's interesting is the money's almost all spent.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, back to my prediction question about what will happen next. My informed prediction is that the money will just be extended and expanded. However, what's interesting about that comparison to the US is that amount of money, the European Peace Facility, was equal to what the US contributed until about May, when the US had a legislative act to add zeros, and make this huge 75 billion US dollar contribution. And so what's interesting about that is that the EU has everything you've told us is that the infrastructure is there, the infrastructural power is there to add zeros. And so what I think will actually do this, and I'm ashamed because I might add more of a comment than a question, but what I think will actually do this is a market distorting crisis coming from the defense industry, because all the supplies are exhausted, basically. And that's the case in the United States too. One of the reasons why the United States is spending so much money is to refill the coffers of the defense industry that has transferred so much equipment to Ukraine. And the same thing has happened in the EU, where a lot of the defense industrial stocks are close to zero now because of that transfer. Not fully zero, but very low. And so the defense industry is rising prices in a crisis comparable to the COVID-19 medical equipment supply crisis that prompted the next generation funding. Because the next generation funding is to fund EU recovery, but it was also to resolve a market distorting equipment and supply crisis around medicines and PPE and things like that. And so that crisis is brewing in the defense industry, where there will have to be a top-down price fixing is not the right word, but price control plus fiscal capacity. So my guess is zeros. But I also don't know. What do you think about what meeting or what moment I should be watching for? There's my question. There's my question. What should I be watching more closely about?
Who's the next Hamilton in Europe?
Exactly. Which meeting of the commission of the council should I be watching to see whether my prediction is true? That a functional pressure will push it.
Yeah.
It's a great question. Vivien, do you want me to answer right away, or?
I think so, yeah.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Kaya. No, that's absolutely great, and I'm grateful. The comparative part was helpful in your eyes as well. Maybe I'll take them in reverse order, because I think your question on the European Peace Facility kind of helps us to get to the bigger question perhaps you had there. But I think the European Peace Facilities, I mentioned it in my slide somewhere here. Let me go back to where it is. This European Peace Facility is actually a very interesting instrument, because it was created at the same time when the member states negotiated the multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, and NextGenerationEU. And there we are talking about zeros, in the sense the MFF is 1.2 trillion euros, and NextGenerationEU is 0.8 trillion euros. The European Peace Facility is peanuts in comparison, because we're only talking about 5 billion euros. From a legal institutional point of view, the interesting aspect is that it's the first time that the member states are putting together a budget for common foreign and security policy, common security and defense policy, and it's done off budget. So the European Peace Facility is not part of the overall financial architecture of the European Union. It is created in this pillar of the European Union, the foreign security policy, where special rules apply, and particularly the key rule is council unanimity. Moreover, the funding is state transfers. So basically states are putting their money into a common coffer, and then they manage it jointly. And it's a very limited sum of money, but as you said, once the war exploded, all of a sudden that little facility that nobody had even noticed because it was irrelevant in the overall scheme of things 2 years before has become very important. And as you said, in less than 3 months, it basically evaporated. All the money have gone. So some issues are interesting here. Number one is that there is entrepreneurial action by the Commission and the central institutions that propose to do something, and it's small, and then a crisis comes in and increases the need to enlarge it. There is also this interesting dimension where the European Peace Facility is originally built outside the main financial framework of the EU, and there's no role for the European Parliament and the Council, so it's you don't have majority voting. It's entirely left to unanimous decision making. But as a crisis grows, there is a need to use it more flexibly. So the likes of Ireland or Austria did not really put any veto on the use of use of money to purchase lethal weapons to Ukraine, and so I think there are lots of typical dynamics of European integration. You have sort of spillover, you have path dependency, you have also, I think, some federalist thinking about what should be done. And so the real issue is, why do some crises lead to step forwards and some do not, I think. And here I want to go back maybe to a comparison with the Euro crisis, because to me, the response to the pandemic and the response to the Euro crisis are like opposite and have led to totally different models of responses. In the case of the Euro crisis, we effectively ended up with a system of fiscal surveillance, super tight control, major inequality in the treatment of member states. Countries getting financial aid were subject to macroeconomic imbalance adjustments procedure with basically their sovereignty taken away, and countries which were paying into common budgets like Germany, the European Stability Mechanism, got enormous amount of power. Here we are in a totally different system. It's fiscal federalism rather than fiscal surveillance, no inequality in the treatment of states. Actually, you don't have sticks, but you have carrots. So how do you explain that? I think some answers can be given. One is a crisis asymmetric or not? That's clearly a big factor. So the euro crisis didn't hit the north, it only hit the south. And so you could plausibly develop the narrative that it's the South fault, that it's the sinners who have been spending more than they should that have caused this, and so they should pay. Whereas the pandemic is really a symmetric crisis, and nobody can be blamed for it. There's no sort of responsible country for what has happened. Then, secondly, I think you might also have. I don't know if you can call it political imagination or I'm in want of better words, but it has to do with morality. I mean, again, I go back to something I was saying yesterday as well. The images of the piles of coffers in Bergamo at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, that was a shocking image for everybody. And it's also, you need to imagine that something has to be done about that, and that requires some forms of solidarity. The euro crisis, I mean, the Greeks were cooking their books. It's just a lot harder to develop that sort of a common action for common purpose. So that's again a difference. And then, last but not least, I still think you have economic interest that are very influential. So the case you were just mentioning now about sort of military supplies and procurement is a typical example of that, just as much as the German automakers in 2020 realized that if the Italian economy was collapsing, their supply chains were going to broke down, and one of their biggest export market was going to collapse. So the same is now here with the war. You have a need to buy anti-missile systems, and there isn't enough of them out there in the market. So you've got to do something together. So I guess I'm under theorizing all this, but I hope those are some helpful points to consider.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I wanted to push you to do, to theorize from this wonderful, rich material. Yeah, thank you.
Open up for others. Daniela?
So Federico, this is all impressive because it's really a holistic view of the whole picture, and it's very hard to develop one. So I congratulate you for this, and I look forward very much to reading the book, but I haven't yet. So I want to ask you some questions that I'd like to hear your opinion on. So in particular, let me give one, and then there may be more. How likely are we to have a new constitutional convention, so to speak? So you seem to make the case that a reform of the treaty is necessary in order to have the future that you imagine here. In other words, rules can be reinterpreted, and you explain very clearly which rules are harder and which are a little bit easier to reinterpret, but only up to a point. Against the background of the rule of law crisis, you don't want to give the impression that rules mean nothing. And if rules mean something, as you say, we need to change them. So more power to the European Parliament, no unanimity in the field, in the fiscal field, as a matter of council voting. These are huge steps forward that you expect Europe to take. So we have political scientists in the room, which is amazing. So the question arises, how likely are we in the 2020s, in this decade, to produce a new treaty with the reforms that you have identified as necessary? In 2009, the Treaty of Lisbon entered into force. Since 2009, very, very divisive things have happened. The aftermath of the Euro crisis was divisive. The Arab Spring and the immigration crisis, the deaths in the Mediterranean, were divisive because it was a request from the South for help that went completely unheeded. Brexit was divisive. The pandemic was not divisive up to a point. The war is divisive. So the rise of authoritarianism in Eastern Europe, in Italy, is extremely divisive. The chances that Italy will mess up the use of the NGEU due to the transitional government is divisive. So how likely are we to take those amazing major steps of treaty reforms that are at the basis of your proposal? Realistically, this doesn't take away from the beauty of the proposal, but I'm just asking how long will it take?
Can I answer this right
Please,
away?
please.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That's a great question, and I'm very grateful you raised it, because it obviously deals with one of the key, at least to me as a EU lawyer, issues ahead of us. And I fully agree also with your assessment that Europe is divided. I fully agree with your assessment that it's difficult to change the treaties. That's the bottom line. With that said, I see two possibilities, and I'm conscious I'm getting into the prediction business, which I want to avoid, so I'll just outline what I think might be possible avenues forward, more than giving you my 2 cents on whether that's going to happen or not. But number one is I could see a possibility for limited, targeted changes to the treaties of the likes we have experienced in the last 10 years. So Article 136 was modified in 2011 to allow for the establishment of this European Stability Mechanism. And there was no need to call a convention for that. It could all be done by a European Council decision. The European Parliament consented to it, and it was done through a simplified revision process. You could think of something similar here for specific amendments on voting rules, on the involvement of the European Parliament, therefore which legislative procedure you apply to specific treaty articles. And the European Parliament has actually proposed that. So just last month, a little bit earlier than that, in July, the Parliament approved a resolution calling for an amendment to two specific treaty articles, including Article 48, Section 7, which is the simplified revision procedure, which, if approved, would actually, it's a kind of a technical thing that people don't get excited about, but if you actually pass those more changes, it makes a heck of a difference in the functioning of the EU. So that is a possibility to my mind. Then, more broadly, I would personally endorse the plan of a larger constitutional convention reflecting on the treaties, but I also agree with you that is unlikely to fly given the division in Europe. And so a couple of years ago, the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the European Parliament asked me to write a report thinking of possible avenues forward, precisely to deal with this big question. So again, I'm grateful you're asking that to me, so I can say more about it. But I wrote this lengthy report where I essentially suggested that one possibility to overcome the deadlock of treaty changes, where you need everyone to agree, you need every parliament and some electorates to vote in favor, which makes it close to impossible to get, is that you draft a separate thing, which I call the political compact, and this treaty would have separate or different entry into force rules. This is exactly, since you are a lawyer, just to justify better my idea, this is exactly what was done at the time of the euro crisis. So the key legal instrument used to deal with the euro crisis were international treaties outside the legal order of the European Union. Think of the treaty establishing the ESM, think of the Fiscal Compact, think of the agreement establishing the Single Resolution Fund. This is not EU law, it's traditional international law. But de facto, it's totally connected with EU law. It's using international law to do things you aren't able to do internally. But the key point is that those instruments had special entry into force rules, which instead of requiring unanimous agreement and ratification by contracting parties, introduced supermajority requirements. So the ESM could enter into force when 80% of the states were ratifying it. The Fiscal Compact entered into force when actually 12 Eurozone states ratified it. And so by doing that, by changing ratification rules, you clearly change the incentive of the ratification games, because if you need unanimity, the holdout will have the power. If you don't have unanimity, the holdout will be just out. There's empirical evidence of how changing ratification rules has changed the game. So, for example, Ireland, which it's my host state, so I can't criticize it too much here, but they voted down every single treaty that came in front of them as of late. First Nice and then Lisbon. But with the Fiscal Compact, they had to vote on it, and their vote was not essential for the treaty to enter into force. So they kind of swallowed the difficult decision and approved it, simply because they wanted to be part of something that would have gone on and forward without them. So I think that's a model to look at. And just full disclosure, I'm not inventing anything. That's how the US Constitution was made. I mean, the Articles of Confederation required unanimous agreement between the 13 states to be amended. And then folks in Philadelphia came up with Article 7 of the US Constitution that says this Constitution will enter into force if 9 states ratify it, which was blatantly in breach of the Articles of Confederation itself. But of course, if you didn't have it, Rhode Island would never have allowed the Constitution to enter into force in this country. So I'm kind of trying to use that same logic for the EU, but I think we need to be creative around this because it's not going to be the Irish the problems, but as you mentioned, Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland. Do we really want the future of the EU to depend on what these autocratic governments are and their parliaments and their fake constitutional courts are saying? We can't. So here's some ideas.
I just realized we're running out of time, so I'll collect the last question.
Yeah, I guess you partially already answered to my question. First of all, I'm Isabella Trombet. I'm a visiting researcher here at the Center for the Study of Europe, and I'm a former student of your father.
All right.
I guess you partially answered my question, which was more based, was regarding how you said that Italy is going to be at the center of the attention and it's going to have a very important role. Well, then my question is, what is the weight of the new political turn in Italy? Is it going to be just an annoying fly in the room where the machine is already running, so this sad incident is not going to weigh much, or is the political way in which Europe and Italy specifically is turning going to be a hurdle in the process you explained?
Great question. Want me to answer this or
Collect, yeah.
May I? Small question. It has to do with my own research. I'm sorry, yes. My name is Jorge Piernas. I'm a fellow at Harvard Law School, visiting fellow for this term, and my question...
And a professor of competition law at Murcia University.
Of competition, European law in Murcia University. And my own research has to do with state aid and competition and the evolution of the internal market. I say this because we have, from this angle, we have analyzed the different crises, the Euro crisis, the COVID crisis, the pandemic crisis, in a kind of different logic, but I think it has to do a lot with what you are saying, and it has to do with the next generation funds. Let me explain it very shortly. There is some similarity in the reaction of the EU in the context of state aid in the 3 crises, even though they were different. The question, as you said, the point was, let's suspend the rules. But they couldn't suspend the rules because they are treaty rules. So what they did was effectively suspend them by adopting a temporary framework that allowed for everyone to give as much aid as it could. The problem is that not all member states can give the same amount of state aid, and that has created a significant distortion of the function in the market and a huge distortion of cohesion. Also no discrimination, and there is a cumulative effect from the Euro crisis, then the COVID crisis, which was especially distorted because it was really, you can give as much, not in one sector, the financial sector, but in any sector. But now with the war in Ukraine, you have the same logic, the same temporary framework, the same provision, by the way, a provision that had never been used in the past. It has been used already like hundreds of times in the last 3 or 4 years. Article 107.3b. It was the nuclear option in the treaty according to the framework. Well, the nuclear option now applied every day. We apply it every day. This has led some to say that the whole constitutional, the constitution of the is changing now in a way. Now we have suspended the set of rules. Member states, particularly Germany, can give significant, much more aid than other member states. Germany announced last week that it's going to give 200 billion euros to its own companies. And the General Court has recently accepted a Commission decision approving a German measure, but also a French one and a Swedish one, which allow aid to be granted not to companies active in their member state, but established in the member state. This goes against the heart of the non-discrimination principle. This goes against cohesion. So the answer of the EU institution, in part, is the next generation. They have said the problem is solved because now through the next generation, you can invest in cohesion. And the harm that Germany and others are doing to the internal market could be palliated, in fact, or mitigated by the cohesion fund and the research and the RRF. So I suppose this can lead to the establishment of a permanent fiscal capacity of the EU. This can be another way to get to that. I'm afraid it's going to be insufficient. I believe that the way in which the system has worked for 60 years has more or less avoided this situation. I think the way in which the system has been working in the last 5 years will make lasting distortive effects on the cohesion of the internal market. But the answer I hear also from the institution is the next generation fund will work on that. So in a way, they have also changed the treaty rules. They have not suspended the stated rules, but in a way they have. But now we have the next generation to compensate that. And if that's how it works, it's going to work, it will have to be permanent, I believe. I wanted to have your views on this, and then, like everyone else, really congratulations for your work.
So you have exactly 3 minutes.
Perfect.
before the taxi will-
That's great. No, thanks to both Isabella and Juan Jorge for the questions. Much appreciated. On Italy, very briefly. Obviously, I think the jury is still out. And the first action of the Meloni government seems to be a bit inconsistent. On the one hand, they say we will honor the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, and then the first act they pass is a suspension of the application of the new rules on the criminal trial, which were passed to honor obligation of the recovery plan. So I think from a political science perspective, it's going to be an interesting experiment. Will European constraints and financial incentive prevail, or will ideology take over? Now, I've studied Brexit for the last 5 odd years of my life, so I'm not sure. Sometimes ideology can really drive people crazy. So I think there is a serious risk. But as I said, I'm also increasingly convinced that Italy doesn't matter anymore so much, that there are sorts of bigger issues here that don't depend on role. But your point, Juan, is actually perfect, because I think with your expertise as a EU competition lawyer, you are emphasizing, I think, what you were mentioning previously from a political science perspective, that de facto the responses to the war are creating again this major asymmetry between Germany, which has the fiscal firepower and the power to pass some assistance measures like the 200 billion euros funds to its companies that other countries don't have. And it's kind of remarkable how the primary beneficiary of the internal market, which is Germany, doesn't seem to care. Because you would imagine that they will have a strong interest in maintaining a sort of a vibrant internal market, which they are dominating anyway. But if the result is to distort competition to the point that you basically, you kill off competition in other countries and then you are the monopolist, but consumers still will have to buy goods, and if there's no cohesion policy that supports that in the other countries, how do you do it? So it seems to me so short-sighted, but definitely the discussion we saw in the last few weeks with German rejection of a price cap and rejection of a NGU 2.0, and then you have 200 billion euros for your own home companies, it's not a positive sign. So I don't want to end on a negative note, but I see certainly a lot of challenges here, but a lot to work on for people at the Center for the Study of Europe and elsewhere who are interested in European affairs.
So please join me in thanking